Hello, my dear friends. Imagine the medieval world at night. Stone castles resting under moonlight. Torches burning softly along quiet corridors. A world where kings lived far above ordinary people. Above law, above judgment, and often above restraint. In medieval times, kings were not only rulers, they were believed to be chosen by God, and this belief gave them power that few could question. And when power had no limits, behavior slowly changed. Many medieval kings lived lives that shocked even their own time, not because of love or romance, but because of excess, obsession, and lack of control. Stories not told openly, but whispered and passed quietly between servants, priests, and nobles. Court life hid many secrets, and behind thick walls and heavy doors, kings lived without consequence, rules applying to everyone else but rarely to them. Some kings surrounded themselves with luxury day and night, feasts that never seemed to end, wine flowing freely, music echoing through halls long after midnight, pleasure becoming routine and routine turning into expectation. When desire became constant, it grew stronger, and kings began demanding entertainment beyond comfort, not always violent, not always illegal, but always excessive. Many medieval kings kept large personal courts filled with favorites, people chosen not for wisdom or skill, but for attention, admiration, or loyalty. And these favorites gained power simply by being close, spreading jealousy quickly through the court. Marriage meant little in such settings, as royal marriages were political rather than emotional. Kings expected to produce heirs, not happiness, while outside marriage discretion was expected but not always practiced. Some kings became known for constant affairs, not hidden and almost celebrated, with mistresses living near the court and sometimes even inside the castle, while queens were expected to endure in silence. This imbalance created tension not only emotional but political, as favor could change the fate of entire regions, and a whispered word from a favorite could ruin a noble family. Religion officially condemned excess, yet priests depended on royal protection. Sermons softened, warnings became prayers, and behavior continued. What shocked people most was not desire itself but obsession. When kings ignored duty for indulgence, when councils waited while rulers disappeared into private chambers, and when kingdoms slowed because attention was elsewhere. These stories spread quietly through taverns and monasteries, never spoken loudly because speaking too openly was dangerous. But memory remained, and reputation slowly formed, until some kings became legends not for conquest or wisdom but for scandal. And as the night deepens in our story, these kings sit alone in candlelight, surrounded by luxury yet increasingly disconnected from reality, showing how power without limits does not explode suddenly, but erodes slowly. Imagine the royal court as morning arrives, light passing through tall stone windows, servants moving quietly, and the king waking not to responsibility, but to indulgence. In medieval courts, power created distance. Kings lived surrounded by people, yet deeply isolated from ordinary life. This isolation shaped behavior more than cruelty ever did. When no one can say no, desire slowly replaces discipline. Kings were raised to believe they were different from others, chosen, elevated, and untouchable. From childhood, they were served, obeyed, and praised. Over time, This constant reinforcement changed how they saw themselves and others. Desire stopped feeling like a private feeling and became something to be fulfilled simply because it existed. Many medieval kings lived within rigid political marriages arranged in childhood. These marriages were treaties, not relationships. Queens were symbols of alliances, heirs, and stability. Emotional connection was rare. Affection, when it existed, was not expected to be exclusive. Kings sought intimacy elsewhere, often within the court itself, where servants, nobles, and companions lived under their shadow. Over time, this created a culture where access to the king's attention became a form of currency. Being noticed meant protection. Being favored meant power. Desire and politics blended until they were impossible to separate. This environment encouraged excess. Feasts were not just celebrations, but nightly routines. Wine dulled judgment. Flattery replaced honesty. Kings surrounded themselves with people who agreed, admired, and entertained. Advice became softer. Warnings were ignored. When someone tried to resist or criticize, they were removed quietly. Isolation deepened. The king's world narrowed to pleasure, comfort, and immediate gratification. Responsibility felt distant, almost unreal. Rumors traveled quickly in medieval courts. Servants noticed patterns. Guards heard whispers. Clergy sensed imbalance. Yet speaking openly was dangerous. Instead, stories moved slowly, carried from place to place by travelers, monks, and merchants. These stories shaped reputations. Some kings became known less for governance and more for indulgence, not because people exaggerated, but because behavior repeated itself too often to ignore. What shocked contemporaries most was not immorality, but neglect. When a king's attention drifted too far from rule, kingdoms felt it immediately. As time passed, indulgence created instability. Jealousy within courts grew. Rivalries intensified. Decisions delayed. Favoritism replaced merit. Small choices driven by desire led to large political consequences. Alliances weakened. Rebellions formed quietly. Trust eroded. Medieval people may not have had modern language for psychology, but they understood patterns. They knew when a ruler's focus had shifted inward, and they feared what would come next. As the day fades again in our story, the court grows quieter. Candles replace sunlight. Laughter echoes down stone halls, softer now, heavier. The king remains surrounded by comfort, yet farther than ever from the people he rules. Power without balance does not collapse loudly. It fades gently, one indulgence at a time. Imagine time moving forward inside the same stone walls, years passing quietly while habits harden into routine. What once shocked the court slowly became expected. When a king repeats the same behavior often enough, people stop reacting. They adapt. This is how excess survived in medieval courts, not through loud rebellion but through silence. Servants learned which doors not to question. Advisors learned which subjects to avoid. Even clergy chose their words carefully, wrapping warnings in gentle language that could be ignored without consequence. Over time, desire stopped being an impulse and became a pattern, repeated daily, protected by rank and ritual. Some kings began to divide their lives into two worlds. One was public and ceremonial. In this world, they wore crowns, led prayers, and appeared before the people. The other world existed behind curtains and closed chambers, where rules bent and time felt slower. This separation allowed kings to believe they were still good rulers, even as their private lives grew increasingly uncontrolled. The mind finds comfort in separation. As long as the crown remained polished and ceremonies continued, many convinced themselves nothing was truly wrong. Inside the court, attention became dangerous. To be noticed by the king was no longer an honor alone, but a risk. Favor could change without warning. What pleased one day could anger the next. This instability created fear disguised as loyalty. People smiled carefully. Conversations became guarded. The court felt awake at night and exhausted by morning. When desire governs unpredictably, everyone learns to move quietly. Kings who lost balance often mistook stimulation for meaning. Feasts grew longer. Music grew louder. Companions changed frequently. Yet satisfaction never lasted. Each indulgence required another. Medieval chroniclers sometimes described these kings as restless pacing halls late at night, unable to sleep despite comfort. Power had given them everything except peace. This restlessness spilled into governance. Decisions were rushed or delayed. Promises were made and forgotten. Trust eroded slowly, like stone worn by water. Outside the palace, common people felt the effects without understanding the cause. Taxes changed suddenly. Laws were enforced unevenly. Officials were promoted for favor, not skill. These signs told people something was wrong, even if they never saw the king's private world. Medieval societies were deeply observant. They read patterns. They understood when leadership had lost its center. As night returns again, imagine the court dimming. Torches flicker. Voices lower. Somewhere behind heavy doors, the king seeks distraction once more. Not from boredom, but from emptiness. The kingdom sleeps uneasy, sensing imbalance without naming it. As the night grows quiet, let us move slowly onward. There is more to uncover. History has not finished speaking. Imagine the passage of time smoothing sharp edges yet leaving impressions behind. In the medieval world, reputation mattered almost as much as law. A king's name traveled farther than his armies, carried by messengers, monks, traders, and songs whispered at tavern tables. When behavior repeated itself, it became story. When story repeated itself, it became memory. This is how private habits slowly shaped public identity, not through confession or proof, but through accumulation. One rumor alone meant little. Many together became a shadow that followed a ruler everywhere. Chroniclers wrote carefully. They chose words that hinted rather than accused. They spoke of excess, distraction, and indulgence. They described courts filled with noise while borders grew quiet. They noted how councils met less often, how petitions waited longer, how justice felt uneven. These were not attacks. They were observations. Medieval writers believed history should warn the future, not embarrass the present. So they framed moral decline as consequence, not scandal. A king who lost restraint, they implied, also lost clarity. Within the court, people learned to read moods the way sailors read weather. A smile could mean safety. Silence could mean danger. Favor shifted like wind. Those closest to the king learned to stay useful, entertaining, and agreeable. Truth became rare. When truth disappears, leadership becomes fragile. Kings surrounded by praise began to confuse admiration with loyalty. They believed affection could replace trust. It never could. The queen's position often reflected this imbalance. Bound by duty, watched by the court, she became a symbol of stability in contrast to chaos. Some queens withdrew into prayer. Others focused on charity and order. Their quiet strength often held courts together when kings drifted. Medieval society noticed this contrast. They respected restraint. They valued balance. When a ruler lacked it, the absence felt loud, even in silence. Beyond the palace walls, people adapted as they always did. They adjusted expectations. They relied more on local leaders. They prayed for steadiness rather than brilliance. Medieval life taught patience. People knew rulers were human, flawed, and temporary. What mattered was whether the system could survive weakness. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. As evening settles again, imagine bells ringing softly, marking hours that pass whether a king listens or not. Time continues its work. Reputation settles like dust. What remains is not detail, but lesson. Power magnifies what already exists. When discipline fades, desire does not rest. It repeats. Imagine now that years have passed, and the king is no longer young. His body carries the weight of indulgence, his face marked by nights without rest, his movements slower than before. Medieval kings did not age quietly. Their habits followed them into old age, shaping not only how they lived but how they were remembered. Excess leaves traces. It softens authority. It dulls urgency. What once felt powerful begins to feel heavy. At this stage, the court often changed its tone. Laughter became forced. Celebrations felt repetitive. The same pleasures no longer satisfied, yet nothing replaced them. Kings who had ruled through desire often struggled when their strength faded. They had not built habits of discipline, reflection, or restraint. Without constant stimulation, they felt lost. Medieval chroniclers sometimes described such rulers as confused or withdrawn in later years. No longer dangerous, but no longer effective either. This was when consequences truly appeared. Heirs grew impatient. Nobles grew bold. Councils acted independently. The kingdom learned to function around the king rather than through him. Power does not vanish suddenly. It leaks away. One decision ignored, one order delayed, one meeting unattended. Over time, the crown remains, but its influence thins. Stories solidified during this period. What people forgave in youth, they judged in old age. Excess that once seemed private now felt irresponsible. People began to compare the king to his predecessors. They measured stability against chaos. They asked quiet questions. What was gained? What was lost? Medieval societies were deeply aware of legacy. A king's final years mattered more than his early victories. Some rulers attempted correction late in life. They turned to religion. They donated wealth. They sought forgiveness. These acts were sincere for some, strategic for others. Medieval people accepted repentance, but memory remained. You could soften a reputation but not erase it. The past lingered like echoing footsteps in empty halls. As night returns once more, imagine the palace quieter than ever. Fewer guests, shorter feasts, longer silences. The king lies awake, not surrounded by indulgence now, but by memory. Power has given him everything and taken clarity in return. History watches patiently. It does not rush judgment, it waits until patterns are complete. Imagine a kingdom that slowly adjusts its rhythm, not because it chooses to, but because it must. When a king becomes unpredictable, the world around him does not stop. It adapts. Medieval courts were living systems. They learned quickly where danger lay and where silence was safer. Over time, people stopped expecting guidance from the throne and started relying on routine, tradition, and each other. Power still existed, but it no longer flowed smoothly from the king's voice. It moved quietly through habits built to survive his absence of focus. Councils met even when the king did not attend. Decisions were delayed until the right mood appeared. Messages were rewritten softly so they would not provoke irritation. This careful navigation became normal. No one spoke of it openly. It was simply understood. The king was present yet not central. This was one of the most fragile stages of medieval rule. Not open tyranny, not collapse, but drift. Within the palace, daily life continued with strange calm. Servants performed their duties. Meals were served. Candles were lit. Music played in the evenings. Everything looked proper on the surface. Yet beneath it was tension. People measured their words. They watched expressions. They learned when to leave rooms quietly. Fear did not shout. It whispered. Some kings sensed this shift and resented it. They mistook distance for disrespect. They demanded louder praise, grander gestures, greater attention. But forced admiration never restores authority. It only exposes insecurity. The more they reached for control through indulgence and attention, the less stable the court became. Loyalty cannot be demanded forever. It must be earned repeatedly. Outside the palace walls, life followed its own pace. Farmers rose before dawn. Merchants traveled cold roads. Families prayed, worked, and rested. These people rarely saw the king, but they felt the results of his absence. Laws became inconsistent, taxes unpredictable, protection uneven. Medieval people were patient but not blind. They noticed when leadership lost balance, and yet the world did not fall apart immediately. That is the quiet truth of history. Systems can carry weakness for a long time. The medieval world survived many flawed kings because communities learned resilience. They relied on custom more than command, faith more than law, local bonds more than royal promises. As night settles again over the kingdom, imagine a palace lit softly, functioning on memory rather than guidance. The king remains at its center, yet the center no longer holds everything together. Imagine now a court where silence carries more meaning than words. In the medieval world, silence was not empty. It was heavy. It was careful. It was learned. When kings lost balance, people learned to communicate without speaking. A look could warn. A pause could protect. A bowed head could hide disagreement. This quiet language grew stronger as royal behavior grew weaker. The throne still stood at the center of the hall, raised and decorated, yet authority no longer lived in the chair. It lived in caution. Over time, even celebration changed. Feasts were held because tradition demanded them, not because joy filled the room. Music played, but softer. Laughter sounded thinner. Guests watched one another as much as they watched the king. Everyone understood that unpredictability ruled the court now. Desire, Mood and impulse shaped the day more than law or reason. This made life exhausting. People longed for routine, not excitement. Kings who ruled this way often believed they were feared. In truth, they were avoided. Fear and respect are not the same. Medieval society understood this deeply. A respected king could walk freely among his people. A feared king moved surrounded by guards, distance, and ritual. Physical closeness disappeared. Emotional distance grew. The court became a place of performance, not trust. Some kings attempted to restore control through punishment. Others tried generosity. Neither worked for long. Punishment increased resentment. Gifts increased dependence, not loyalty. True authority requires steadiness. Without it, even power becomes fragile. Medieval writers noticed this pattern again and again. They described kings who ruled loudly but governed little, surrounded by noise yet alone. As years passed, memory replaced presence. People spoke more of what the king had been than what he was. Stories froze him in time, often at his worst. History is not cruel, but it is selective. It remembers patterns, not excuses. A ruler who allowed indulgence to replace discipline left behind a clear outline, easy to recognize centuries later. As evening falls once more, imagine the court emptying early. Torches dim, voices fade. The king remains awake, but the kingdom sleeps around him, learning to live without his guidance. Imagine many years passing, so many that the faces at court have changed. New servants walk the halls. New nobles sit in council. Even the king feels older, slower, more distant from the impulses that once ruled his days. Yet the past does not disappear. In medieval life, memory was long. Stories lived in monasteries, in family conversations, in quiet remarks shared by travelers on cold roads. What a king did in private did not vanish when he grew quiet. It settled into the shape of how people remembered him. At this stage, the court often became strangely calm. Not peaceful, but settled. People no longer expected change. They no longer hoped for reform or feared sudden shifts. They had learned the pattern. The king would act as he always had. The court would respond as it always had. This predictability, born from excess, became its own kind of stability. Medieval societies valued order deeply, even flawed order. Chaos frightened them more than weakness. Kings who had ruled through indulgence sometimes believed they were forgiven simply because time passed. They mistook silence for acceptance. But medieval silence often meant something else. It meant endurance. People waited. They watched. They recorded quietly. Monks wrote notes in margins. Clerks copied letters carefully. These records were not accusations. They were reminders. History, even then, was being prepared. Religion played a complicated role here. Confession allowed kings to seek forgiveness from God but not from memory. Acts of charity softened judgment, but did not rewrite behavior. Medieval faith taught mercy, but also truth. A king could be forgiven spiritually and still remembered imperfectly. This balance mattered deeply to medieval thinkers. They believed God judged the soul, but history judged the reign. As indulgence faded with age, some kings grew reflective. They spent more time alone. They listened more than they spoke. In these quiet years, many realized too late what discipline might have offered them. Peace, stability, trust. These were things no amount of pleasure could replace. Yet regret, like excess, arrives quietly and stays. Outside the palace, the world moved on. Children grew into adults knowing only the later version of the king. To them, he was distant, ceremonial, tired. They heard stories of his earlier years as warnings, not entertainment. This is how scandal transformed into lesson, not through outrage, but through repetition. As night settles once more over the stone halls, imagine the king resting, not from satisfaction, but from weariness. The past lies behind him, unchangeable. The future belongs to others. Imagine now that the king is no longer the center of attention in his own story. The court still exists. The crown still rests on his head. But something has changed quietly. People no longer speak about what he will do next. They speak about what his reign has taught them. This is the moment when a ruler stops being a living force and becomes a warning shaped by time. In medieval society, lessons were not taught loudly. They were absorbed slowly. Parents spoke carefully to children. Masters guided apprentices with stories rather than rules. When they spoke of kings who lost themselves to excess, they did not use names at first. They described patterns. A ruler who listened only to desire. A ruler who confused pleasure with power. A ruler who believed silence meant approval. These stories were not meant to shock. They were meant to steady people, to remind them that authority without balance always weakens. Inside the palace, this shift could be felt in small ways. Courtiers no longer competed for attention as fiercely. They focused on protecting their families, their lands, their futures. Loyalty became practical, not emotional. Respect became formal, not heartfelt. The king noticed this distance but often misunderstood it. He believed people had grown colder, not wiser. He believed time had changed them, not him. Medieval historians understood something important. Scandal rarely destroys a kingdom by itself. What destroys stability is repetition without reflection. When behavior continues without correction, it drains trust. Trust, once gone, cannot be commanded back. It must grow slowly, over generations. Many kingdoms survived scandalous kings because they learned to place hope in the future rather than the present. This is also when succession became important. Heirs were watched closely. People asked quiet questions. Would the next ruler repeat these mistakes or learn from them? Would discipline return? Would balance be restored? The sins of one king shaped expectations for the next. In this way, even flawed rulers influenced history deeply. As years passed, the king's presence faded into ritual. He attended ceremonies. He signed documents. He appeared when required. But the emotional center of the kingdom had already moved on. Power, once personal, became procedural. This was safer. Less inspiring, perhaps, but steadier. Medieval societies valued survival over brilliance. As night falls again, imagine the palace wrapped in stillness. The king rests, not troubled by desire now, but by distance. Outside, life continues, quieter, stronger, more patient than any ruler. Imagine now a kingdom that is fully adjusted, not in panic, not in anger, but in quiet endurance. This is one of the most important moments in medieval history. Even though it looks calm on the surface, the people no longer wait for the king to change. They no longer expect correction or renewal. Instead, they build their lives around stability that does not depend on him. This is how societies survive rulers who fail to govern themselves. They stop reacting emotionally and begin relying on habit, faith, and community. The king still exists, but he is no longer the emotional anchor of the realm. In the court, everything feels slower now. Not peaceful, but settled into repetition. Meetings follow scripts. Ceremonies repeat the same words year after year. Nothing new is introduced unless absolutely necessary. Innovation feels risky under unstable leadership. Medieval people understood risk deeply. When the center feels weak, the edges become careful. Everyone chooses safety over ambition. This slows progress, but it preserves order. Kings who once lived loudly often grew quieter in this phase, not always out of wisdom but out of exhaustion. Desire that once burned hot now flickers weakly. The body no longer follows the mind's demands. Illness, age, and fatigue take their place. For some kings, this quiet felt like punishment. For others, it felt like relief. The world finally slowed to match their strength. Chroniclers observing this stage wrote differently. Their tone softened. Anger faded. Judgment became reflective. They no longer focused on scandal itself, but on consequence. They described reigns as uneven, distracted, or diminished. They noted lost opportunities rather than personal flaws. This shift matters. History does not always condemn loudly. Sometimes it simply records what failed to happen. The people, meanwhile, continued living. Weddings were held, children were born, crops were planted. Festivals came and went. Life does not stop for flawed rulers. It flows around them. Medieval villages often felt more stable than courts at this time. Local leaders mattered more than royal moods. Trust became small and close, not distant and symbolic. This is the quiet strength of medieval society that is often overlooked. It endured kings who lacked restraint by leaning on structure older than any crown. Customs, faith, shared labor, memory. These held communities together when leadership drifted. In this way, scandalous kings unintentionally revealed the resilience of the people they ruled. As night settles again, imagine the palace dim and quiet, almost forgotten by the rhythm of daily life beyond its walls. The king sleeps. The kingdom rests without him at its center. Imagine now that the king's reign is nearing its later chapter, not with drama but with quiet routine. Medieval history often moves this way, not with sudden endings, but with long fades. By this time, the court knows exactly what to expect. There are no surprises left. Scandal no longer shocks. It has become familiar, almost dull. And in this dullness, something important happens. Emotion drains away, and reflection takes its place. People begin to speak about the reign with distance, not anger, not fear, just observation. They describe years as uneven. They talk about missed chances. They mention how the kingdom felt smaller, slower, less focused. These are not insults. They are measurements. Medieval thinkers cared deeply about balance. When balance was lost, they noted it calmly, the way one might describe a river that slowly changed its course. Inside monasteries and scriptoria, writers copied earlier records and added small notes in the margins. These notes did not shout. They whispered. They connected behavior to outcome. They linked indulgence to distraction, distraction to neglect. neglect to weakened rule. This is how medieval history taught lessons, not through blame, but through pattern. At court, younger nobles watched carefully. They learned what not to do. They learned that power without restraint leads to isolation, that pleasure without purpose empties quickly, that being obeyed is not the same as being trusted. These lessons were absorbed quietly, carried forward into future reigns. In this way, even flawed kings shaped better rulers after them. The king himself often sensed this shift, not always clearly, but emotionally. He felt less needed, less consulted, less central. This can be a heavy realization for someone raised to believe they were chosen. Some reacted with bitterness, others withdrew. A few accepted it with resignation. Medieval life did not encourage emotional confession, especially for kings. Feelings were hidden behind ritual and formality, yet they were there, unspoken, shaping behavior. As the years passed, the court became almost peaceful again. Not because problems were solved, but because expectations had lowered. Stability returned through predictability. Everyone knew the limits. Everyone worked within them. This was not greatness, but it was survival. Medieval societies respected survival deeply. As evening settles once more, imagine the palace quiet, candles burning low, pages turning softly in distant rooms. The king rests, the court breathes evenly, and history watches without urgency. Imagine now that the king's presence feels lighter, almost transparent, as if the world has learned to move without noticing him. This is how many medieval reigns truly ended, not with rebellion or celebration, but with gradual disappearance from daily thought. The crown remained visible, the title unchanged, yet attention drifted elsewhere. People focused on harvests, marriages, prayers, and weather. The king became a background figure, part of the scenery rather than the story. When a ruler loses the ability to shape daily life, history begins preparing its closing chapter. In the court, formality replaced emotion completely. Councils met because custom demanded it. Ceremonies followed ancient scripts. Decisions were made carefully, often by those who had learned to protect the kingdom from uncertainty. No one expected inspiration anymore. They expected continuity. Medieval societies valued continuity deeply. A quiet reign was better than a chaotic one, even if it lacked strength. Chroniclers writing during this time grew increasingly measured. They avoided dramatic language. They summarized years in a few sentences. They noted patterns rather than events. This style of writing signals something important. When historians stop describing moments and start describing eras, it means the reign has lost its urgency. It no longer feels alive. It has become something to be studied, not experienced. The people closest to the king often felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that unpredictability had faded. Sadness that potential had been wasted. Medieval culture believed strongly in purpose. A king was meant to guide, protect, and balance. When that purpose faded quietly, it felt like a promise left unfulfilled rather than a crime committed. Religion offered comfort here. Faith allowed people to place meaning beyond human failure. Priests reminded communities that earthly rulers were temporary, imperfect by nature. This belief softened disappointment. It allowed people to accept weakness without despair. In this way, medieval society protected itself emotionally, not just politically. As the king aged further, his days became simple: short walks, quiet meals, long rests. The excesses of youth felt distant, almost unreal. Time has a way of smoothing sharp memories, even for those who lived them. Yet the imprint remained, not as outrage, but as understanding. This is how scandal becomes lesson. It loses its heat and gains shape. As night settles again, imagine the palace calm and steady, no longer tense, no longer loud. The reign has become history, even before it officially ends. Imagine now that the reign exists mostly in memory, no longer felt in daily decisions but carried quietly in stories and records. This is where history becomes selective. Medieval people did not remember everything. They remembered what mattered to survival, to order, to meaning. Details faded. Patterns remained. The king's indulgences, once whispered with caution, were now spoken of with calm distance. Not as gossip, but as explanation. This is why things unfolded the way they did. This is why certain opportunities were missed. This is why the kingdom learned to rely on itself. In monasteries, scribes copied older texts onto fresh parchment. As they worked, they made choices. Which events deserved space? Which years could be summarized? Which behaviors explained outcomes? These choices shaped how future generations would understand the reign. Medieval history was not written to entertain. It was written to guide. Excess was mentioned, not for shock, but as a warning sign. A marker that balance had slipped. Among nobles and officials, conversations shifted tone. They spoke less about blame and more about preparation. How to ensure the next reign would be steadier. How to rebuild trust slowly. How to remind future kings that restraint protects power more than indulgence ever could. These discussions were quiet, practical, and forward-looking. Medieval leadership valued continuity above correction. Fixing the future mattered more than punishing the past. The people, meanwhile, incorporated the reign into their understanding of the world. They told their children simple lessons: that leaders are human, that power magnifies weakness, that silence can be a response, not approval. These lessons did not mention names. They did not need to. Everyone understood the reference. This is how scandal dissolves into shared knowledge. The king himself, now distant from the center of events, lived within this softened reality. He was treated with formality and courtesy. Respect remained, but intimacy did not return. This quiet distance was not cruelty. It was balance restored. Medieval societies were skilled at recalibrating without confrontation. They valued peace over resolution. As years continued, even the strongest emotions faded. Anger cooled. Disappointment softened. What remained was shape, a clear outline of how indulgence altered leadership, how courts adapted, how communities endured. This outline became part of the broader medieval understanding of power. As night settles once more over the quiet kingdom, imagine history closing its hands gently around the past, not to hide it, but to hold it steady. Imagine now that enough time has passed that the reign no longer feels personal to anyone living within it. This is when distance begins its quiet work. Distance does not erase events. It rearranges them. What once felt immediate becomes organized. What once felt shocking becomes explanatory. Medieval societies were skilled at this transformation. They did not rush to forget. They allowed time to sort meaning from noise. By this stage, the king's behavior was no longer discussed as individual acts. It was discussed as a phase. People spoke of those years rather than specific moments. This shift matters. It shows that the reign had been absorbed into a broader understanding of how power behaves when left unchecked. The court no longer reacted. It functioned. The kingdom no longer waited. It proceeded. Institutions grew stronger in response. Councils formalized their roles. Legal customs became clearer. Religious authority emphasized moderation and order. These changes were not announced as corrections. They were framed as improvements. Medieval societies preferred evolution over accusation. By strengthening structure, they reduced dependence on any single ruler's character. In this way, scandal indirectly produced stability, not because it was accepted, but because it revealed weakness that needed reinforcement elsewhere. Kings came and went. Institutions endured. This realization shaped medieval political thought deeply. It taught leaders that personal indulgence weakens not only reputation, but relevance. When systems can function without you, your power has already faded. Stories told during this time became calmer, less emotion, more clarity. People no longer argued about what should have happened. They described what did. They noted cause and effect. Indulgence led to distraction. Distraction led to delegation. Delegation led to institutional growth. This chain was understood intuitively, even if never written as theory. The king, now mostly ceremonial, existed within this strengthened structure. He benefited from it, even as it diminished his personal influence. Life became easier for him. Fewer decisions, fewer demands, fewer moments of pressure. In a quiet way, the system protected him from his own weaknesses. This was not mercy. It was pragmatism. As generations shifted, younger people learned about the reign not as a scandal but as a chapter. One example among many. This is how medieval history maintained continuity. It placed flawed rulers into context rather than isolation. It allowed lessons to survive without constant judgment. As evening settles again, imagine the kingdom steady and quiet, held together by customs older than any crown. The king rests within that order, no longer shaping it, but supported by it. Imagine now the longest view, the one medieval people themselves rarely named but deeply felt. This is the moment when a reign stops belonging to a single king and starts belonging to history itself. Years pass. Seasons repeat. Children who were born during the height of scandal grow into adults who know that time only as background. For them, the king's excess is not a shock or a rumor. It is simply part of how the world once was. This is how history completes its work, not by erasing mistakes, but by folding them into structure. By this stage, the kingdom has adjusted so fully that daily life feels steady again. Markets open on time. Courts function predictably. Religious calendars guide the year with familiar rhythm. The weight of the crown feels lighter because it rests on many shoulders now, not one. Councils, customs, and local leaders carry responsibility quietly. Medieval societies prized this shared burden. It made survival possible when leadership faltered. What once seemed scandalous now feels instructive. Chroniclers look back and describe not actions but consequences. They write about a reign that drifted inward, that lost its outward focus. They note how attention moved away from borders, justice, and care for the people. These observations are calm, careful, and deliberate. They are meant to teach future rulers what imbalance looks like before it becomes disaster. The most important change, however, happens inside the idea of kingship itself. Expectations shift. People stop believing that personal charisma or desire can sustain authority. They begin valuing restraint, predictability, and presence. A good king, they decide, is not one who feels powerful, but one who makes others feel secure. This quiet shift influences coronations, education of heirs, and advice given by clergy and elders for generations. Even language changes subtly. Words used to praise rulers now emphasize steadiness over brilliance, stability over excitement, moderation over indulgence. These values seep into sermons, stories, and counsel. Medieval culture evolves not through revolution, but through accumulation of lessons. One flawed reign adds weight to a growing understanding of what leadership requires. The king himself, now largely a figure of ceremony, lives within this transformed world. He is treated respectfully, but no longer central to identity or hope. This distance is not cruelty. It is balance restored. The kingdom has learned to protect itself by reducing reliance on individual character. In doing so, it has grown stronger than any single ruler. As time continues its slow work, even the strongest memories soften. What remains is shape, not detail. A clear outline of how excess narrowed vision, how silence spread, how communities endured. This outline becomes part of medieval wisdom, passed quietly from one generation to the next. As night settles once more over this long view of history, imagine the past resting peacefully, no longer demanding reaction or judgment. It has given its lesson. It has taken its place. Imagine now that the king's reign has fully slipped into the past, not ended with a moment, but settled into memory like an old road no longer traveled, yet still visible. The throne may now belong to another, but the imprint of what came before remains. Medieval people believed deeply that the past stayed alive inside the present, not loudly, quietly, in habits, in caution, in choices made without explanation. The new reign begins under this shadow. Advisors speak more carefully. Councils insist on routine. Ceremonies emphasize duty and restraint. These are not reactions of fear, but of learning. The memory of indulgence has taught them something valuable. That leadership must be shaped, guided, and supported. That power alone is not wisdom. This understanding becomes part of governance itself. In royal households, education changes subtly. Young princes are taught patience before privilege. They are reminded that desire is not command. Tutors tell stories, not of scandal, but of consequence. They explain how courts grew silent, how trust thinned, how kingdoms endured despite distraction at the top. These lessons are absorbed slowly, like sleep settling into the body. They do not shock. They steady. Among the people, memory transforms into instinct. They no longer speak openly of the old king's excess. They don't need to. When they see signs of imbalance, they recognize them immediately. When a ruler grows distant, they adjust expectations. When discipline weakens, they strengthen community bonds. Medieval societies learned resilience this way, not by fixing rulers, but by protecting life from instability. Even religion reflects this learning. Sermons emphasize moderation. Clergy speak of leadership as service, not entitlement. Confession is framed not as escape, but as responsibility. Faith becomes a stabilizing force, reminding both rulers and subjects that power is temporary and balance eternal. These ideas sink deep into culture, shaping behavior long after names are forgotten. Historians looking back generations later see this clearly. They notice how one flawed reign influenced several stable ones that followed, how institutions grew firmer, how customs tightened gently, how silence, once dangerous, became intentional calm. This is how medieval history works. It does not erase mistakes, it builds around them. As night settles again over the imagined kingdom, imagine streets quiet, homes warm, and life continuing with confidence earned through endurance. The king of scandal exists now only as a lesson, not a threat. Imagine now a world that no longer depends on memory alone, but on habit. This is where the deepest change appears. Medieval society did not simply remember flawed kings. It quietly redesigned daily life so that one person's weakness could no longer disturb everything. This did not happen through laws written overnight. It happened through repeated small choices, made over decades, guided by experience rather than anger. Councils gained confidence during this time. Advisors learned when to speak and when to wait. Procedures became clearer. Decisions were recorded more carefully. Nothing about this felt dramatic. It felt careful. Medieval people trusted what was slow and proven. They had learned that sudden passion, whether in rulers or reforms, often led to imbalance. Stability was built through repetition. At court, behavior shifted subtly. Displays of excess were no longer admired. Quiet discipline became fashionable. A ruler who rose early, attended councils, and listened patiently earned respect more than one who dazzled with personality. This shift did not come from morality alone. It came from exhaustion. People had lived through distraction. They wanted calm. Among nobles, marriage and household life took on new importance. Private behavior was no longer seen as separate from public rule. The idea that a king's inner life shaped his outer decisions slowly became accepted. This understanding influenced expectations placed on rulers. Balance at home suggested balance in governance. Excess suggested risk. The people absorbed these ideas naturally. They did not debate philosophy. They lived it. Villages valued predictability. Towns trusted leaders who showed up consistently. The memory of instability sharpened their instincts. They became less impressed by charm and more attentive to reliability. This was not cynicism. It was wisdom earned through time. Even language reflected this shift. Praise changed tone. Words like steady, measured, and constant appeared more often than bold or magnificent. Medieval culture learned that endurance mattered more than excitement. This change was quiet but powerful. It shaped expectations for generations. Looking back, historians see this moment as one of growth disguised as decline. A flawed reign forced society to mature. It learned how to support itself. It learned how to limit damage without confrontation. It learned how to survive human weakness without surrendering order. As night settles again, imagine a kingdom resting easily within its routines, no longer anxious about who sits on the throne. Life flows smoothly, guided by habits stronger than impulse. Imagine now that enough time has passed for caution to feel natural rather than forced. This is a quiet but powerful transformation. What once began as careful behavior around a flawed ruler has become ordinary life. People no longer think of it as protection. They think of it as the way things are done. Medieval culture often changed this way, not through announcements, but through habit settling into the body like muscle memory. In courts across the realm, schedules grew firm. Councils met at set hours. Records were kept with greater care. Decisions were discussed in groups rather than whispered privately. These changes were not reactions to one king alone. They were responses to experience. Experience had taught people that when leadership becomes unpredictable, shared structure becomes safety. Over time, structure stopped feeling like defense and started feeling like order. The role of advisors changed as well. They were no longer entertainers or flatterers. They became guardians of rhythm. Their job was to keep days balanced, to prevent extremes, to notice when mood threatened judgment. Medieval people respected those who maintained balance quietly. Loud advice was ignored. Steady presence endured. Religious life also absorbed these lessons. Rituals emphasized regularity. Prayer followed fixed times. Moral teaching focused on moderation rather than punishment. The message was gentle and repetitive. Excess disrupts peace. Restraint preserves it. These ideas were not preached as reaction to scandal. They were offered as guidance for living well, for rulers and common people alike. In towns and villages, leadership mirrored this shift. Local figures earned trust by being consistent, not impressive. They showed up. They listened. They acted slowly. Medieval communities learned that stability grows from reliability. This understanding spread upward as well. Expectations placed on kings grew quieter but firmer. A ruler did not need to inspire awe. He needed to be present, predictable, and attentive. This period is often overlooked in history because nothing dramatic happens. There are no rebellions, no sweeping reforms, no grand speeches. Yet this is where real change settles. When lessons stop feeling new, they start shaping identity. The memory of scandal fades, but its influence remains woven into daily life. As years continue, the old king becomes a distant reference, not a focus. People speak less of what he did and more of what was learned. This is how medieval societies preserved wisdom, not by reliving mistakes, but by adjusting behavior so those mistakes no longer fit easily. As evening returns again, imagine streets quiet and steady, bells marking time without urgency. Life moves forward smoothly, supported by habits stronger than any single will. Imagine now that the story of the scandalous king is no longer told with caution or emotion, but with calm familiarity. This is the final stage of memory before it dissolves fully into history. The reign has become something people reference without tension. It is no longer close enough to hurt and no longer vivid enough to alarm. Instead, it exists as a quiet guide, shaping instincts rather than conversations. In medieval households, elders sometimes mentioned the old reign while speaking about patience or restraint. Not as gossip, not as accusation, but as context. They would say things like, "We have seen what happens when balance is lost," and nothing more needed to be explained. Everyone understood. This shared understanding was powerful. It meant society no longer needed reminders. The lesson lived inside people. Kings who ruled after this period often felt the weight of this invisible guidance. They sensed expectations without hearing them spoken. When they acted impulsively, advisors paused. When they lingered too long in pleasure, councils quietly redirected attention. The system had learned how to correct gently, not through force but through rhythm. This was medieval wisdom at its most refined. Court life reflected this calm maturity. The halls were quieter, not out of fear but out of focus. Work happened early. Evenings ended sooner. Entertainment existed, but it did not dominate. Pleasure returned to its place as rest, not escape. This balance did not feel strict. It felt natural, earned through experience. The people trusted this rhythm. They felt safer knowing that no single desire could shake everything. They invested in long-term life again. Families planned futures. Merchants traveled with confidence. Faith felt steady rather than desperate. These are signs of a society that has absorbed its lessons fully. Historians looking back see this phase as resolution without drama. The scandalous king did not need to be condemned forever. His reign did its work by revealing limits. By the time memory softened, the damage had already been corrected through culture. This is how medieval history healed itself. Slowly, quietly, without spectacle. As night settles again, imagine the kingdom resting in confidence it once lacked. The past no longer presses. The future feels open but grounded. The old king exists now only as a shape in memory, his excess transformed into understanding. Imagine now the widest possible view, the one that medieval people themselves never fully saw, but slowly lived inside. This is the moment when a single flawed reign stops being about a king at all, and becomes part of how an entire civilization understands power, weakness, and survival. Nothing dramatic announces this shift. No bell rings. No decree is written. It happens the way sleep arrives. Gradually, gently, without effort. By this time, the kingdom has completely absorbed the experience. What once felt dangerous now feels instructive. What once caused tension now creates confidence. People no longer brace themselves against the throne. They trust the rhythm of daily life more than the mood of any ruler. This trust is not naive. It is earned. Medieval society has learned that endurance comes from shared structure, not individual virtue. Institutions now carry weight naturally. Councils do not wait for permission to function. Laws are applied with consistency. Customs guide behavior even when leadership feels distant. This is not rebellion. It is maturity. The system no longer depends on personal discipline because it has learned to protect itself from personal failure. This is one of the most powerful achievements of medieval civilization, though it rarely receives attention. The idea of kingship itself has changed quietly. A king is no longer imagined as a figure of unchecked desire or overwhelming presence. He is seen as a caretaker of balance, someone who must fit into the system rather than dominate it. This expectation reshapes education, ceremony, and advice. Young rulers are taught restraint before authority, listening before command, routine before indulgence. These values are not imposed harshly. They are normalized. Even language reflects this deep change. Praise becomes softer. Criticism becomes rarer because behavior no longer invites it. Words like steady, measured, and orderly carry more weight than powerful or grand. Medieval culture has learned that excitement fades, but balance endures. This realization shapes art, faith, and daily conduct. The old king whose excess once unsettled the court now exists only as a distant echo. His name may still appear in records, but emotion no longer follows it. He has been transformed into context, a necessary chapter in a longer story. His failures did not destroy the world. They taught it how to survive better. This is the quiet triumph of medieval society. It did not collapse under weakness, it adapted, it learned, it softened sharp edges without breaking. It did not need to shame the past to move forward. It simply adjusted the future. As night settles once more over this long, patient history, imagine the world resting easily within itself. Streets are quiet. Homes are warm. Leadership feels predictable, not thrilling, but safe. Life flows without fear of sudden imbalance. Imagine the kingdom now living inside a calm it once had to learn. Not a calm born from innocence, but from experience. This calm does not depend on any single ruler's virtue. It is supported by habit, expectation, and shared understanding. Medieval people reached this state slowly, by living through uncertainty and discovering what truly held their world together. What they inherited was not a story of scandal, but a way of living that could endure it. Daily life reflects this inheritance in small, almost invisible ways. Markets open with confidence. Courts hear cases without delay. Messengers travel predictable routes. People trust schedules. They trust seasons. They trust one another more than they trust personalities. This trust is the quiet reward of lessons learned without shouting. Medieval society has grown comfortable with steadiness. It values the ordinary because the ordinary keeps life intact. Leadership, too, carries this calm. Rulers are no longer expected to be extraordinary. They are expected to be present, to listen, to keep rhythm. When they do, praise is gentle. When they don't, correction is subtle and collective. This does not feel like control. It feels like shared responsibility. Power has been softened without being weakened. Even memory has changed shape. The old scandals no longer sit at the center of stories. They appear at the edges, as context, as explanation, as background. People no longer ask who was at fault. They ask what was learned. This shift marks a mature relationship with history. Medieval thinkers understood that blame exhausts, but understanding stabilizes. In monasteries and schools, lessons are framed carefully. Students are taught that authority grows fragile when it turns inward, that discipline preserves clarity, that excess narrows vision. These teachings are not dramatic. They are repetitive. They are meant to sink in slowly, the way sleep does after a long day. This is how medieval wisdom travels, through calm repetition, not force. The people feel this wisdom without naming it. They sense when a leader's focus drifts. They sense when routine strengthens. Their trust rises and falls accordingly. This instinct protects them. It keeps life moving forward even when individuals stumble. The society has learned to lean on itself. As time continues, the world shaped by these lessons feels stable enough to forget their origin. That is the final sign of success. When a lesson no longer needs retelling because it has become behavior. When history no longer presses because it has already done its work. As night settles again over this steady world, imagine the past resting quietly behind it. No longer urgent, no longer heavy, simply present, like a path that brought people here and no longer needs to be walked. Imagine now a time when order no longer announces itself. It does not arrive with ceremony or warning. It simply exists, quietly supporting everything beneath it. This is the moment medieval societies worked toward without naming it. A moment when leadership feels steady enough that people stop noticing it. When rules feel natural. When restraint no longer feels like sacrifice, but like comfort. Daily rhythms now move without friction. Bells mark hours gently. Work begins and ends on time. Disputes are settled through familiar processes. Even festivals feel calmer, less urgent, more grounded. Pleasure exists, but it does not overflow. It rests inside limits that everyone understands. These limits are not feared. They are trusted. They protect rest as much as order. Courts reflect this ease. The grand halls are no longer tense spaces of performance. They are working rooms. Voices are measured. Decisions are paced. Advisors speak without flattery. Silence is no longer defensive. It is thoughtful. This kind of silence allows listening. It allows correction before damage forms. Medieval people came to value this deeply because they had lived through its absence. Rulers, too, are shaped by this environment. They learn quickly that attention is not the same as influence, that desire is not direction. They see how easily systems can carry them when they act within rhythm, and how quickly resistance forms when they push against it. This awareness does not crush authority, it refines it. Power becomes lighter, easier to carry. The memory of scandal now exists only as a distant contour. It does not intrude, it informs. It reminds leaders to pause. It reminds advisors to stay present. It reminds people to rely on shared structure rather than personalities. This is the quiet wisdom medieval societies prized above all else, the kind that keeps working when names are forgotten. Even art and storytelling change tone. Songs grow softer. Tales emphasize patience over triumph. Heroes are admired for steadiness rather than conquest. These shifts are subtle, but they matter. Culture reflects what people hope to preserve. In this phase, they hope to preserve calm. As generations pass, children grow up knowing only this steadier world. They hear of earlier imbalance as something distant, almost unreal. For them, moderation feels obvious. Routine feels safe. This is how the deepest changes succeed, when they no longer feel like changes at all. As evening settles once more, imagine homes warm, streets quiet, and minds at ease. The world holds itself together without effort. History has finished shaping behavior and stepped back. Imagine now a world that no longer waits for greatness. This may sound small, but it is one of the strongest places a society can reach. Medieval life, after long exposure to excess and imbalance, learned to value the ordinary more than the exceptional. Not because ambition disappeared, but because survival had taught them what truly lasts. The ordinary keeps the world moving. The ordinary keeps people fed, safe, and rested. In this phase, leadership blends into daily life. Kings still exist, thrones still stand, ceremonies still happen, but none of them dominate the emotional center of society. People wake with the sun, work through familiar routines, and return home with predictable thoughts. This predictability is not boredom, it is relief. After uncertainty, relief feels like peace. Councils now function almost without effort. They do not rush. They do not panic. They follow established rhythm. Decisions take time, and that time is respected. Medieval societies learned that haste often hides fear. Slowness, when shared, creates trust. This trust spreads outward, from courts to towns, from towns to villages. The role of the king during this period is subtle. He listens more than he speaks. He confirms more than he commands. When he appears, it is expected, not dramatic. This quiet presence reassures people more than spectacle ever could. Authority feels safer when it is calm. Medieval people understood this deeply, even if they never put it into words. Memory continues to soften. Stories of excess are now told without emotion, almost like weather reports from long ago. They explain why certain customs exist, why certain limits are respected. They no longer provoke reaction. They provide context. This is when history becomes truly useful, when it guides behavior without demanding attention. Families feel this stability most clearly. Parents raise children with confidence that tomorrow will resemble today. They plan seasons ahead. They invest in land, trade, and learning. Fear no longer shapes choices. Caution does, but it is calm caution, not anxious restraint. This is the sign of a society that has healed. Faith also reflects this ease. Prayer becomes gratitude rather than pleading. Ritual becomes grounding rather than urgent. People trust the flow of time again. They trust that mistakes do not end the world. They trust that balance, once learned, can be maintained. As night settles over this quiet confidence, imagine a kingdom no longer watching itself nervously. Life unfolds without strain. The past has taught its lesson and stepped aside. As the quiet deepens, we continue gently. The end draws nearer without urgency. History rests comfortably now. Imagine now that time has done nearly all it can do. Not by erasing the past, but by smoothing it into something that no longer presses against the present. This is the phase where meaning settles fully. People no longer think about the old reign when making choices. They simply live within the structures that grew because of it. The lesson is complete when it no longer needs memory to survive. In this world, life feels whole, not perfect but balanced. The court operates like a well-worn path. Everyone knows where to stand, when to speak, and when silence serves better. There is no fear of sudden shifts. Even disagreement feels contained, guided by habit and expectation. Medieval society has learned that calm is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of reliable ways to handle it. Leadership during this time feels almost invisible. A king signs documents, attends ceremonies, listens to counsel, and follows routine. His personality matters far less than his consistency. People no longer hope for brilliance. They hope for steadiness. And because that hope is met, attention moves back to life itself. Crops, families, trade, prayer. These become the true center again. Stories told in this period sound different. They no longer linger on warning. They describe continuity. They talk about how things are done, not why they must be done that way. This is the final success of a lesson. When explanation is no longer needed, when behavior carries wisdom without words, the old scandalous reign has now fully transformed. It exists only as a faint outline in history books and quiet references among scholars. Emotion has drained away completely. What remains is structure, process, balance. The kingdom no longer reacts to what once threatened it. It moves forward with confidence shaped by experience. People feel this confidence in their bodies. They sleep more easily. They plan further ahead. They trust that tomorrow will resemble today. This trust is not blind. It is built on systems that have proven themselves over time. Medieval people valued this deeply. It meant survival had become living. As the night settles once more over this settled world, imagine lamps dimming, doors closing, and thoughts slowing. Nothing needs attention now. Nothing demands reaction. The past has finished speaking. As the quiet deepens, let us move gently onward. Only one final breath remains. History is ready to rest. Imagine now the final stretch of time, where even historians feel no urgency to add more words, because the shape of the lesson is complete. This is where medieval history often chooses silence over commentary. Not because nothing happened, but because everything that mattered has already settled into place. The rain that once stirred whispers, concern, and careful distance has now become part of the deep background, like an old foundation stone beneath a city that no one thinks about, yet everyone relies on. People live their lives without referencing the king at all. They wake, work, rest, pray, and sleep inside a world that feels steady enough to forget how fragile it once was. This forgetting is not ignorance. It is success. It means the system learned, adjusted, and healed without tearing itself apart. The court moves with calm confidence. Nobles understand their roles without instruction. Councils meet because it is time, not because there is danger. The rhythm of governance feels almost natural, as if it always existed this way. In truth, it was shaped by experience, by imbalance endured and corrected quietly. The old excess that once pulled attention inward now serves only as a distant contrast, making the present feel even more balanced by comparison. Chroniclers of this later period write less about people and more about continuity. Their pages describe harvests, laws, festivals, and borders. Kings appear briefly, almost incidentally. This tells us everything. When rulers fade into routine, it means society has reclaimed its center. The memory of scandal no longer demands reaction or explanation. It has been transformed into structure so completely that it no longer feels like memory at all. Faith reflects this calm as well. Prayer sounds steady, not desperate. Ritual feels grounding, not urgent. People trust that order will hold through the night. Even the idea of power feels lighter now, less personal, more shared. Authority rests in expectation rather than fear. In this final stage, history does not condemn or forgive. It simply settles. It allows the past to lie where it belongs, not buried, not displayed, but resting, its work done. The world moves forward without needing to look back. And that, in medieval understanding, is the clearest sign that balance has returned. Imagine now that there is nothing left for history to add. Not because the story was small, but because it has reached its natural rest. Medieval people understood this moment well. They did not force endings. They allowed them to arrive on their own, quietly, when no loose thread still pulled at the present. The reins we have walked through no longer shape thought, fear, or expectation. They sit behind the world like a distant hill, visible only if you turn and look. Life does not lean on them anymore. It leans on habit, on rhythm, on shared understanding. This is where history becomes complete. Kings come and go. Names fade. Even scandal softens until it becomes texture rather than weight. What remains is not judgment, but balance. Not outrage, but clarity. Medieval society learned that power without restraint weakens itself, and restraint without cruelty strengthens everything around it. That lesson has already been absorbed. It no longer needs repeating. The court is quiet now, not from silence imposed, but from peace earned. Councils continue their work. People sleep without worry of sudden change. The world feels held together by things older and stronger than any single ruler. Customs, time, human endurance. History does not close with punishment or praise. It closes with stillness. With the understanding that even the most flawed reign can leave behind something useful if time is allowed to do its work. Now let the images fade completely. Let the crowns grow distant. Let the past rest where it belongs. For now, remain still. Let the quiet deepen. Let history sleep.